Good afternoon, everybody. Tell you a little bit. Let's start here. About, must be nearly 35 years ago. I was standing at Lord Airport, the immigration stand there, and I pull out this ancient British passport that I have, and I hand it to the lady behind the counter. Now, she picks up the passport, and she looks at the name inside. It says, John, John Sinclair. Not a very Jewish name. So she looks up at me, and I'm dressed in sort of standard Haredi outfit, the hat, the coat, everything. She looks at the name, she looks up at me. She flips the passport to the picture page, and there is this picture of this jet-setting Hollywood record producer with a Douglas Fairbanks moustache and a very, very self-satisfied look on his face. It must have been something like this. So she looks down at the picture. She looks up at me. She looks down at the picture. She closes the passport, and with this sigh, which mixes tremendous sympathy and total bewilderment, she says, "What happened?" So I replied to her with 2 words in Yiddish. Now, I don't know a lot of Yiddish, but 2 words in Yiddish I do know. I said to her, "Pintele Yid." She said, "Ma?" Apparently her Yiddish was about as extensive as mine was. So I translated for her into Ivrit Modernit, HaModernit. I said, "Netzotz HaYehudi," which translates into English as the Jewish spark. Chazal teaches, inside every Yid there's a little Pintele Yid, and it never, ever, ever goes out. However far a person becomes estranged from the beliefs, the knowledge, the traditions of our fathers and our grandfathers, there's a little spark, a little candle that goes on glowing in the darkest of darkness. I guess, as Reb Shlomo said, some 35 years ago, I decided to come to Or Sameach. And if you told me back then, when I was a record producer, producing records in London, in Los Angeles, in New York, and if you told me then that 35 years later, 37 years later, I would be standing here this afternoon speaking to you now, I'd have changed my manager. People ask me, how did you become frum in Hollywood? So I tell them, if living in Hollywood doesn't make you frum, nothing will. When you're working in the dream factory, when you see the secular world up close, eyeball to eyeball, you have a very good idea of the tremendous fakery that the secular world is, and what a powerful fakery it is. So how did I get from Hollywood to the Holy Land? Well, to cut a long story short, I always wanted to be an actor. When I was a kid, I always acted in school plays. And when I went to university, I studied drama and English. And the difficult thing about being an actor is to be an actor, you have to have what's called an equity card, a union ticket. A union card. Now, to get a union card, to get an equity card, you have to have a job. But to have a job, you have to have an equity card. I managed to kind of break into the industry because they were putting together a touring company of this musical, which you've probably never heard of, called Hair. Yeah, you remember Hair? So back in the early 70s, there was this big musical called Hair. It was like a hippie musical, and it started off Broadway, went to Broadway, and now it went to London, and now they were putting together a tour around the provinces of England. And each cast had about 30 boys and girls, so they were looking for 90 kids, which is why they dropped the rules a little bit. 90 kids who could all sing, dance, and act. Well, I could act, I could sing, and as I wrote on my resume, I could move well. I managed to move well enough to get myself a job in the touring company of Hair, and we toured. I spent 6 months touring around the provinces of Leeds, Birmingham, Bristol. We went up to Aberdeen, Liverpool. I can promise you, for a so-called glamorous profession, it's extremely boring. What's the most important part of a play? Everyone's done a play here, right? The most important part of a play, I would suggest, is rehearsal. That's when, everything either comes out or it doesn't come out. It's a bit like baking a cake. What you put into the oven comes out of the oven. What you don't put into the oven doesn't come out. But once you've had your opening night, and you've had your second night, you've had your third, your fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, you're doing 8 shows a week. Every show is 2.5, 3 hours long. It's night after night, night after night. The same thing over and over again, and you've got nothing to do. You're in some strange provincial town, you've no relatives there, you know, friends there, you've seen every movie in town 3 times. So you spend tremendous amounts of time sitting in coffee bars, drinking enormous cups of coffee. Now, I had a friend in the cast, and I remember sitting in a coffee bar one day with him, I think it was in Leeds. We were talking about, 3 things that really interested us. The first of these 3 things was musicals. We were in a musical. We used to discuss how far could you push the edges of the envelope? How far could you push a musical and it would still be, acceptable? The second thing we used to talk about was science fiction movies. We loved the, 1950s, black and white, these cheap science fiction movies which didn't fool anybody. Everybody was I'm not talking about the sort of science fiction movies that you can see nowadays where, the special effects budget was probably marginally larger than the gross national product of Peru last year. I'm talking about the sort of science fictions movies, they spend about 25 cents on this ridiculous inflatable beach ball which kind of bounces around Gotham City, terrorizing the poor inhabitants. We loved these bad science fiction movies, we used to compare notes. You remember Michael Rennie, The Day the Earth Stood Still? Ah, yeah, that was a great one. The third thing we used to talk a lot about was rock and roll. Now, I'm not talking about the sort of rubbish you hear on the radio nowadays. I'm talking about, the real thing, Chuck Berry, Little Richard. We loved all those old records. So I remember we were sitting in this coffee bar in Leeds one day, and I said an idea dropped into my head. I said, Richard, why hasn't anybody written a science fiction, rock and roll musical? His eyes lit up. He said, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. Let's do it. So we sat down that afternoon and we started to write a musical. Well, we hadn't got very far with this musical. We had the idea of this opening scene would be this sort of classic Midwestern wedding there with the white picket fence, and the bride and the groom would drive off and the confetti into the lovely, beautiful sunset. And of course, there'd be this torrential rainstorm as soon as they leave town, the LA police department, fire department pouring millions of gallons of water on some Hollywood set. And of course, what happens? The car breaks down. And the groom turns to the bride and he says, didn't we pass a castle back down the road? Anyway, to cut a very long story short, before we got very far with this musical, I had to leave the cast of Hair. Hair was a very tough job for the actors because it had never been designed to be run month after month on the road. Things you can ask an actor to do for 2 weeks in an off-Broadway studio production. So one of the things that we used to do was this thing called knee acting. Knee acting involved the entire cast of 30 of us walking down stage and as one man falling to our knees. And it must have looked amazing, 30 people suddenly dropping to their knees. The problem is, I don't think the Rebbeinu Shalom had this quite in mind when designing the human knee. And so after 6 months of knee acting, my right knee gave out and swelled up, left the cast of Hair, went back down to London. To cut a very long story short, I got involved in building a recording studio. Now, this recording studio turned out to be the first 24-track recording studio in England, in Europe. Now, I don't know if you know anything about recording, but everything at the time was 16-track. The more tracks you have, basically, the more flexibility you have, the more advanced the technology. So we opened up as 24 tracks, and we were the latest thing on the block. The problem was we didn't have a hit record. And studios stand or fall by their hits. If you have a hit, that's the place, there's the magic, that's it. But if you don't have a hit, so you're another studio, even if you've got great technology. Everybody's looking for magic. So a hit came along in the following way. There was this band that had simply run out of room. They'd run out of tracks. And they were working in a studio called Trident in Wardour Street in the West End of London. And they'd run out of room. They hadn't finished the record. They're putting out their new single, and it was this extremely complicated piece of music. So they had to come to us. We were the only game in town. They come in, with the big, back in the day, these big 2-inch tapes. They put it up on the tape recorder, and we can hear outside in the control and what's going on in there. And this is their new single. I mean, these guys are crazy. Back there in the 70s, Auntie, the BBC, used to rule the airwaves with an iron fist. What the BBC decided was a pop record would get played, and if the BBC didn't play it, that's it, you were dead. But BBC's definition of a pop record was basically something like 2 minutes, 43 and a half seconds in a major key in 4/4 time. I'm exaggerating, but it was very rare. They had very strict, tight programming. This song, which was going to be their new single, was about 4 minutes long. The rhythm, the time signature changed about every 30 seconds. It was in about 5 different keys. We thought these guys were going to be crazy. This is never going to go. How wrong we were. The song was a song called Bohemian Rhapsody. The band was a band called Queen. And basically after that, we could have sold the studio time for about 25 hours a day, bottled the air and stood in the street and sold that as well. Nothing succeeds like success. So as a result of getting this big hit record, which was mixed at my studio, we started to get very good offers of work from the States. And I'm standing in the control room in the studio one day, and this guy comes on the line with this fake American accent. And he goes, oh, hi. You don't know who I am, but I heard you're a real good producer. I got this band. They're going to be number one. We're going to fly over to New York City to produce the album. We're going to get your limousine from the airport to your hotel. We're going to get your limousine from the hotel to your room. We're going to get your limousine from the room to the kitchen. We're going to get your limousine to the limousine to the limousine. And I think to myself, anybody who's got an American accent as bad as this has got to be joking. It takes me 2 minutes into this conversation to realize, no, this is actually a real manager with a real band and a real accent. And before I can say Jack Robinson, there I am in SIR rehearsal studio, standing there with my cousin who's co-producing with me, listening to these guys. And nobody had heard a note of music up to this point. Everything happened so fast, onto the plane. And so, I'm standing there and I'm looking at these guys and I'm thinking, what do these guys can't play? Well, I breathed a sigh of release when they struck up the first 4 bars of a song, and I thought to myself, Baruch Hashem. Well, I would have said Baruch Hashem had I known to say it at the time. Baruch Hashem, a hit record, and it was a hit. The song was a song called Cold as Ice. The band was a band called Foreigner, and that debut album by Foreigner went on to sell over 5 million records. Baruch Hashem. So around this time, I get a phone call from my erstwhile writing partner, Richard. He says, John, what's happening? Are you a record producer? Are you a studio owner? Or are you a playwright? What's happening to our musical? I said, Richard, you write this musical. You've got a basic idea, but you go ahead. And I know a little bit about the business now. When you're finished doing it, we're going to set up a music publishing company to publish the music. You go ahead, take it. So he went ahead and he finished it off, and it became quite successful. I don't know if you ever heard of it. It was called the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So there I was in 1977. I've got the first 24-track recording studio in Europe. I've got a 5 million selling album, 5 platinum records, neatly lined up there on my mother's living room wall. I've got the music publishing of one of the biggest musicals of the decade. It's more than a musical, it's a mishigas. I've got this Mulliner fastback Bentley Continental with a long fishtail back. It's about 3/4 of a block long, pure aluminium body. They only made 150 of them. Inside there's this beautiful burgundy and beige pure leather upholstery that 15 cows have had to die for. In the middle of the dashboard is this beautiful limited edition Smith's analog clock, which is ticking away, ticking away. I promise you this car is so quiet, you can hear the moments of your life ticking away, ticking away. And I'm driving around town and I'm looking at them and they're looking at me, and I'm looking at them and they're looking at me, and I've been eating steak for lunch and steak for dinner and steak for breakfast and steak for steak. And I think to myself, is that all there is? This is it? This is what people practically claw each other, to get to this. This is it. And I was filled with this tremendous sense of emptiness. I went back to London and I started to think to myself, so what do we do here? At the time I was writing some songs with a guy called Robert Levinsky, Oliver Sholem. And we got signed up to Charisma Records. And Charisma Records, we made this single, we wrote this single that Charisma were convinced was going to be an enormous hit. And they put us on the BBC, and the song bombed completely. If I ever see Hashgacha, everybody said this is going to be a #1 hit. And it went absolutely nowhere. So I took another thought about it, and I thought to myself, something? I'm going to go back to acting. That's where my real life, my real love is. Gave up the music business pretty much on the spot. Flew out to the coast, flew out to Los Angeles, got myself an agent. I started to work. I did the first episode of Moonlighting. I did a thing called John and Yoko, a love story. I played George Martin, the Beatles' record producer. I did Half Moon Street with Sigourney Weaver. And I was working. and I start to get the same feeling. Now I'm really in trouble. I have no idea what it is that's going to make me feel fulfilled in life. At this point, I read a book. Really two books, one book within the other. One book was, let's say, the shell, the klipa, and the other was the fruit, the pri. Let's start with the klipa, the shell. The shell, the book that contained the other book, was a novel by a famous Yiddish author, and that sat on my desk in my bookshelf rather in Los Angeles for about 2.5 years until I finally took it. And I read it on a beach in a place called Cabo San Lucas in Baja California in Mexico. Now, for those of you who don't know, Cabo San Lucas is the place where, when the pressure of doing nothing in Hollywood gets too much for you, you can go down to Cabo San Lucas and do nothing down there instead. I took this book and I read it on the beach, and it hit me between the eyes like a juggernaut. The book was about a Baal Tshuva. This is a book about a Baal Tshuva, somebody in the war years, who'd grown up in Poland. And when the Nazis, Yamach Shemam v'Zichron, rolled over this little Jewish shtetl, they rounded up all the Jews. They herded them to this little wooden shul. The stormtroopers run in, they have these bales of hay and kerosene and gasoline, and they throw the torch, and the whole thing goes up in this tremendous inferno, and the screams, the cries that are coming from the shul. And there's a very young, agile teenage boy who manages to clamber his way up to the ladies' gallery, and up and up and up through an open skylight. He escapes, he runs away to Danzig, he gets on a boat, he gets to New York City, and he throws, if he'd had his tefillin with him, he would throw them into the East River. But he threw everything away. All of the thousands of years of Yiddishkeit, he threw away. He turned his back on the Ribbon Shalom, on everything. He starts a completely secular life. Many years later, he's in a bookshop, and he gives the book to the lady behind the counter, and he looks at her, and he realized that this was a girl that he remembered from the town, the shtetl that he grew up in. They recognized each other. They meet, and after these many years, they fall in love, and they get married. And of course, she completely, by now also has become completely secular, completely without any contact to Yiddishkeit. They meet, they fall in love, they get married, and they get married in a totally secular way. A couple of years down the road, once the gloss has worn off and the boredom starts to set in, I don't think I need to go into too many details. The hero of this book comes back unexpectedly one lunchtime. He pulls his key out of the door, puts it in the door, he opens the door, and in front of him he sees a sight. He cannot believe what's been going on. He stands there transfixed by this terrible apparition for a few seconds, and then he rushes into the apartment, runs into the bedroom, opens up a closet. He knows in an old suit he has a few $100, grabs the money, stuffs it into his pockets. He runs out of the door, he runs down the 11 flights of stairs all the way to the ground floor. He runs out of that building, and he's running. He doesn't know where he's running, he's just running away. And he runs all the way down to the Lower East Side of New York City, where all the Jews came off the boats from Europe. And he's just running down this little side street, down there on the Lower East Side. Somebody steps out of a small shtibel and says, a tenth man. Someone needs to say Kaddish for their father, and they can't find a 10th man. And he's just running down the street. Literally, they drag him in off the street, and he's standing there, and he hears, Yiskadeh, Yiskadeh, Shemei Rabo. B'yolamo, divrach Yosei, v'yamlich malchzei. B'chayei choy, u'v'yoymei choy. U'v'chayei d'chol beis Yisroel. Bagalov, his man Kariv, and his heart shatters inside him. He finds himself standing there with tears pouring down his face. He hasn't heard Kaddish in 23 years. And he stands there for a very long time. Everybody else leaves the shul. He finally gets himself together, walks out into the street. He walks a few yards down the street, 50 yards, and he finds himself looking in the window of a Jewish bookshop. In the window of that Jewish bookshop, my friends, was a book called Mesilas Yesharim, The Path of the Just, by Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, Zecher Tzadik Kodesh Livrocha. He was born in Italy, and died here in Eretz Yisrael about 280 years ago. And as he looks through the window, he knows what he's going to do. Goes into the bookshop, buys the book. He goes out into the street. He hails down a taxi cab. He says, take me to the airport. Take me to Kennedy. He gets to the airport. He buys a ticket. He flies to Eretz Yisrael. He gets off the plane. He finds another taxi cab. Says, take me to Yerushalayim. Take me to the Koisel. And they climb up the ancient hallowed hills of Judea. And he gets to the Koisel. And he walks up to those ancient hallowed stones. And he's standing there, crying his eyes out for his life. And somebody walks up, taps him on the shoulder, and says, are you Jewish? And he says, yes, I'm Jewish. He says to him, would you like to come for Shabbos? And he says, yes, I think I would. I think I would. And he leads him back through the streets of Yerushalayim, Eretz HaKodesh, B'Leil Shabbos. Anybody who's done this knows what it's like to walk through the middle of a major road. You do this any other time of the week, you'll be instantly mown down by a number 3 bus. And now there's nothing there, except little children dressed up in their Shabbos finest. And the odor of diesel fumes has been replaced by the aroma of Shabbos cooking wafting on the night air. And he's led into this beautiful, humble home, and the light that shone off that Shabbos table. I was fascinated by this novel. So I got off that beach in Cabo San Lucas, flew back to Los Angeles. I was fascinated to know, what was this book that the hero of this novel, what was this book, the Mesilas Yesharim, that had such a powerful influence that the mere buying of the book. So I went down to a bookshop, I think it was somewhere on Fairfax, and I bought a copy of Mesilas Yesharim with an English translation, because my Hebrew at the time certainly wouldn't have been able to manage it in Hebrew. Mesilas Yesharim was my bedtime reading for the next 3 months, which, if you think about it, is an extremely amusing statement, because Mesilas Yesharim was nobody's idea of a bedtime book. Mesilas Yesharim is a very, very difficult sefer. And as the author himself says, you won't find, why is it so difficult? Because you won't find anything that you didn't already know before. And my friends, that is the most difficult kind of knowledge to inculcate. You see, we're all born with certain innate life wisdom. We know it. Very early on in our lives, we take those essential life lessons, that knowledge, and we lob it into this lead-lined chest in the back of our heads. We slam the door, lock it up with a few padlocks and chains, and that essential life information will stay till the day we die, unless we make a positive, proactive effort to get back in contact with that innate knowledge that we're all born with that Pintele Yid. Mesilas Yesharim is the way, one of the ways you can get in touch with that essential life information that you know all about, but to the extent that these truths are well known by everybody, so are they completely ignored. They cease to have any power on us. This is what Mesilas Yesharim tries to do, tries to get you back into that lead-lined chamber. And really, Mesilas Yesharim is really not a book at all. It just looks like a book. It's a blowtorch. It's a blowtorch that gets you into that lead-lined chamber. But like a blowtorch, it doesn't work at once. Like a blowtorch, you have to keep going at it and going at it and going at it and going. Eventually you get in there. Similarly, Mesilas Yesharim, as the author says, you get nothing out of this book by reading it once. You have to keep reading it and reading it and reading it and reading it. Mesilas Yesharim was my bedtime reading. Is there any more superficial reading than a bedtime reading? When you read a book at bedtime, you don't want to read the book, you want to fall asleep. And yet, if I have to point to one moment on my journey, a crucial moment, a changing of the path, it was reading Mesilas Yesharim. So that was the that was the fruit inside the novel. But what about the novel? Picture yourself, you're in Hollywood, you've read this great novel, what do? No? Huh?
Reach out to the author.
More than that. What do you? You make a movie, right? Come on, we're in movie town here. So I picked up the phone. I found out who the agent of this author was. We started to talk. Yes, the movie rights were still available. I thought, well, hang on a second. This is a major project here. You know, maybe you should find whether this thing has actually got legs. I bought 10 copies of this novel. I gave them out to 10 people whose opinions I trusted. I said, I'm calling you back in a week's time. I want to know, is this a movie? I called them all back a week later. Their unanimous response was the equivalent of, eh. Now, I don't know if this novel was ever made into a movie. I don't think it was. But in a rather strange way, rather than make the movie, I became the movie. Scene 1, Copenhagen, Denmark. I get invited to play Dracula in a comedy musical in the Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen. Now, every actor wants to play Dracula, right? If for no other reason, you'll be able to say in Bela Lugosi's deathless Transylvanian, good evening. So I arrive in Copenhagen, and as the Hashkocher would have it, they gave me to share an apartment with a guitar player in the band who just happened to be a Jewish boy from Manchester, who was about exactly the same age as me. And, we're standing there, first time we're meeting in the flat, we're talking to each other. And he says to me, are you Jewish? I said, yes. I said, are you Jewish? He said, yes. He said, you don't look very Jewish. I said, well, you don't look very Jewish either. So anyway, after this somewhat unpromising start to our friendship, we actually got on very well. He says to me one Friday afternoon, he said, you know something? I've got an idea. There's a beautiful shul here in Copenhagen. Why don't we go down tomorrow morning? It'll be a lark. So I said, okay, why not? So we trudged down, we tromped down to this shul following morning at the bright and early hour of about 11 o'clock. We get in there, and there's this beautiful shul there in Copenhagen. It's like this Egyptian deco architecture. And it's all very, very European and very formal and everything. And I'm sitting there looking around, and I was thinking, wow, this is very, very beautiful here. So I was minding my own business. Suddenly I realized that the shamus is making a beeline towards me. Now, this guy's very impressive looking. He's got this flat Flemish painter's cap, has this long coat on, and he's got in his hand this velvet cushion on which is a silver ingot, a silver plate with a Hebrew inscription. He walks over to me with tremendous aplomb. He proffers it to me. I pick it up and I look at it and I think, wow, this is really nice. I give you a present the first time you come here. This Danish fellow sitting next to me says he's giving you an aliyah. He's calling you up. He's calling me up? I'm 36 years old. This is my first bar mitzvah my first aliyah since my bar mitzvah. How many years is that? It's 23 years since my last aliyah, and I'm going to have to go up there and say the brachas. That's right. There are brachas. There are brachas before and the brachas after. I'm an actor. Where are my lines? So I start to flick through the siddur to find my lines. I go up there, have my aliyah without making too much of a fool of myself, come down, sit back down in my seat, and I think to myself, this is nice. I like this. As I'm lost in this reverie, this Danish fellow sitting next to me turns to me and says, would you like to come for Shabbos? So I said, yes, I think I would. I think I would. And he leads me back through the streets of Copenhagen, which I can promise you are far from being Ir HaKodesh. But maybe as we walked together, there was a little bit of the same feeling. I always like to keep Shabbos in places where maybe nobody ever kept Shabbos before. There's a very special feeling. It's like you're walking in a Shabbos bubble. You're in a completely other reality. And that's what it felt like. I was walking with this fellow. We walked back to his home, and how are we doing? Walked back to his home, and I walked through the door, and two things struck me immediately as I walked through this man's home. There are two things which are conspicuous in the traditional Jewish home. One's conspicuous by its presence, and the other's conspicuous by its absence. What is conspicuous in by traditional Jewish home? I don't mean bagels and lox. I mean the way the Jewish people have been doing things for the last 3,000 years. Two things are conspicuous. What's conspicuous by its presence? Mezuzah? Books. I'd never seen a room so full of books in my life. I promise you couldn't wage a paperback anywhere between these books. I looked at that wall of books in front of me. I thought, you're such a wise guy with your Mulliner fastback Bentley, but you can't read a word of that. And I was filled with this tremendous sense of my own ignorance. I think it was Muhammad of all people called us the people of the book. The problem is most of us can't read it anymore. And by reading it, I don't mean, going to the Hebrew University and having some inane conversation with a taxi driver, Kain ani meha artzot Brit, or parrot fashioning your way through some ungeblusened bar mitzvah in the Hamptons and getting 300 iPhones as a prize for your labors. I'm talking about understanding what's pshat, what was the secrets locked in those sfarim, in those books, those hundreds and thousands of years ago. And as I looked at that wall of books, I had this tremendous sense of loss. I didn't even know what it was that I'd lost. That's what's conspicuous in a traditional Jewish home by its presence. While we're on the subject, what is conspicuous in a traditional Jewish home by its absence? Television. I don't think the two things are unconnected. Next time you're in a room where people are watching the television, do yourself a favor, don't look at the television, turn around and watch the people watching the television. You'll see something like this. Now take that picture, and we'll leave aside any discussion as to content. Let's just talk about form. Talk about the way, the method of the transmission of ideas. You take that picture and contrast it, lahavdil alaf alfei avdolas, with what goes on next door. The first time I walked into a base medrash, I was terrified. There are people jumping up and down. You think you're going to strap you, and they're going to strangle each other. A person seriously, I consider it a miracle that I've had the schus to teach in Or Sameach boys who've been brought up on an undiluted diet of once upon a time it was television, then it was movies, and now it's TikTok and whatever else that's out there. And I can still, this is an open miracle in my mind, I can still teach a boy to learn Tosfos. I can still teach, because everything about the media, it's not a subject for now, is about defocusing. Now this, now this, now this, now this. Instant forgetfulness. The whole idea of learning is holding cop. I often think that really, that learning Gemara is a bit like juggling. You pick up an idea. Omarava, Omarava. Got it? You know what Rava says? You got it clear? Omarava. Abaya Omar. Oh, you dropped Omarava. Omarava, Omarava. Abaya Omar. You dropped on. Amarava, Amarava, Amaraba, Amarava, Abi Rabbi Say, Rabbi Zebi, Amarava, and then of course, and then we get the Rishonim, the Achronim, the speeding, flaming torches are spinning over your head. There's nothing like it known to mankind. When a person is licked in a sugya, he's really holding in it, and all these fireworks are going around. It's the most beautiful, exciting thing in the world, but it requires holding cop. It's a miracle, an open miracle in my mind that, people can still, you can still teach something, and people can still learn Torah. This is, to me, an open miracle. Okay, enough about this. It's a big subject, and I want to move on to the end, because, okay, so there I am in Copenhagen. I'm in this play, playing Dracula. Before I walk out of this Shabbos meal, this Shabbos daytime meal, they start to talk about Hanukkah. Hanukkah's coming up in a week's time. So I think to myself, something, I'd like to have a menorah this year. So I walk out of that Shabbos, it starts to snow. The streets are filled with these very tall, Nordic-looking people. I start to feel somewhat uncomfortable. I go down to the Jewish shop there in Copenhagen where they sell everything, including Sifrei Torah. One stop. I buy a menorah, I put it in my window. I start to light my candles. Now get this picture. This is Copenhagen. Copenhagen is very near the Arctic Circle. It gets dark in the middle of the winter at about 3:30 in the afternoon. It's a very dark, very northerly place. What is the word in Hebrew for north? Safon. Safon is exactly the same as another word in Hebrew. Safun, which means hidden, because the north is always a place of darkness, of concealment, and there, at one of the darkest times of the year, one of the darkest places in the world, there's a little Pinteliad who's lighting candles. But I have to get up from my candles and go down to the theater, that most Greek of Greek inventions. I light my 8th candle on a very stormy North Sea crossing. The steward comes around, he practically arrests me for fire hazard. I get back to London, I say, Daddy, Where are my tefillin? He says, your tefillin? You haven't put on tefillin since you were bar mitzvah before. Daddy, I'd like some tefillin. Come, let's go down to Golders Green. My father was Shalom, takes me down to Golders Green, he buys me tefillin. What do you do when you have tefillin? You don't leave them in the bag, you put them on. I put them on that day, the day after. I did get a call from my manager in New York. She says, come back, don't go to Hollywood, come back to New York. I want you to work on Broadway. Find yourself an apartment, and as soon as you're settled, call me. I pick up the phone. With one phone call, I managed to find an apartment somewhere in the Middle East side, on the east side of New York City, which is exactly half a block from the nearest Orthodox shul. I turn up there one Shabbos morning, and the rabbi sees in me, he has what we would call in England, a likely lad. He sees I'm dead keen. So he said, why do you come to shul during the week as well? I said, people go to shul during the week? So he said, yeah, so I turn up there one Monday morning, I've got this, the linear siddur, I'm managing to find my way through it, and then something really bizarre, everybody does this. Because I'd never seen Tachanun before. If that wasn't strange enough, at the end of the davening, something really bizarre happens. They open up the bar. There's whiskey, there's bourbon. This is 7:45 in the morning. Now, of course, unbeknownst to me, this is a tikkun, a very time-honored tradition amongst Klal Yisrael that we bring into the schnapps and a little bit of herring. And of course, there's a deeper, more mystical side to this, because when we make the brachas on the whatever it is, the kugel, so the neshama of the departed one, the soul of the person who's passed on, literally has an aliyah in Shemaim. The soul rises up in heaven. Well, I didn't know anything about aliyahs in Shemaim. I just saw a booze up at 7:45 in the morning. So the rabbi sees I'm a little bit nonplussed by this. He walks over to me with this very large whiskey. He says, you're an actor. Actors drink. So purely out of politeness, I took the whiskey from the rabbi. And then he comes to me with an even bigger whiskey. At about 7:55, I stagger out of the shul and I think, this is great. I'm going back tomorrow. So I get back there the following day, and of course they've closed the bar. But by this time, the rabbi has me exactly where he wants me. He said, look, you have to come every week. You have to come every day. You see, this is very shvach. This was a very, very shvacha minyan. When you're davening in a shvacha minyan, when you're the only person not saying Kaddish. That is, of course, except for these three hobos that they kind of wheeled in off the street to make up the minyan. Nobody's quite sure whether these guys are Jewish or not, but they're delighted to get off the frozen New York sidewalk and get a hot cup of coffee and a donut. And my friends, this was the minyan that was makarev me, which is amazing. Because there's something called the Guinness Book of the World's Worst Kiruv Minyanim. This must have been minyan number 2. Nobody in their right mind would think of sending somebody to a place like this to get them more interested in becoming religious. And you know something? HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts each of us on our monorail. What is life for me could be the opposite for somebody else. This was perfect for me. If you'd send me to the Upper West Side, where they have these all whistles and bells, Kiruv Minyanim, where they announce the page in English 4 times, and I say, please get me out of here. This was very Hamish, very unthreatening. So there I am, I'm davening, and the rabbi calls me up. We'll finish with this a couple of weeks later. It's about 2 minutes to Shkia. He says, quickly, come down. We need a 10th man for Mincha Ma'ariv at center. I go down there, and we daven Mincha Ma'ariv, and when we finish davening Mincha Ma'ariv, I realize afterwards why it is that they call it Mincha Ma'ariv, because that's about the length of time it takes them to daven both of them. When we finish davening, so the rabbi says, look, you see what it's like here? Mincha, do you think you come to Mincha Ma'ariv every day? So I said, sure, why not? So there I am. I'm living in New York City. I'm davening 3 times a day. Well, at least twice. I'm trying to keep kosher, trying to keep Shabbos, but I really have no information, no input, no knowledge. Why am I doing these things? Before I can really put it all together, I get invited to go down to Baltimore to do a one-man show that I had. In Baltimore, I find the identical minyan that I left in New York City. Only the names have been changed to protect the innocent. This is a part of Baltimore which was once a thriving Jewish community. All the Jews have now moved out of here, except the last 8 elderly Jewish gentlemen, and they are not leaving for anybody. If you want them out of there, you're going to have to truck them out. Every Sunday morning they have this thing called the breakfast minyan. The breakfast minyan consists of about 24.5 minutes of shacharis and 2.5 hours of breakfast. And at this breakfast they have these conversations which you can honestly believe have been repeated verbatim for the last 35 years. Not a word has been changed. The whole thing sounds like a tape recording. So I'm listening to this conversation, and this was really the thing that brought me here to Eretz Yisrael. I'm sitting there and I hear this conversation. And it went something like this. I always wanted to go to Israel. Yeah? So why don't you go? I'm waiting. Yeah? What are you waiting for? I'm waiting till it's too late. I thought to myself, I'm not waiting till it's too late. I went back to New York, I packed up all my stuff, I got on a plane, I flew over here and I took a seat upstairs in the old base medrash some 35 years ago. And the rest, as they say, I once asked somebody, why me? Why me? You know, if you taken a picture of me back there 35, 40 years ago and you said, one of these guys here in this picture is going to be a rabbi in Jerusalem, which one is it? I would have been the last one that you would have picked. So I once asked somebody this, and he said, could be schus avos. There's an idea that our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents send us pekelach, send us a certain schus. That gets you in the door. Anybody who ends up in Yerushalayim has some kind of schus. Schus atzmo as well. But he said, maybe there's somebody, maybe you know of that person, Kodesh Baruch Hu, blessed me, and I was able to, even at my age of 38 when I first opened the Gemara, I managed to learn a little bit, and to Baruch Hashem to be able to teach and to be mashpia. And really, there's a lot more to it than that, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Pashut kamashmo, yeah?
Any questions, comments, critiques?